Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the environment editor at the public radio program The World, produced here in Boston at WGBH. We'll be talking today about chemical exposures in the brain, the Flint water crisis and more, or as we promoted it on our website, this is your brain on lead and other nasty stuff. We have a distinguished panel this afternoon of experts from Harvard School of Public Health and other institutions around town and the federal government in Washington. Philippe Grandjean is an adjunct professor of environmental health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Jeffrey Griffiths, second to my right, is professor of public health and community medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine. He's also the former chair of the U.S. EPA Drinking Water Committee Science Advisory Board. To his right, Mark Weiskopf, Associate Professor of Environmental and Occupational Epidemiology here at the Chan School, and Kimberly Gray, who'll be joining us from Washington via video link. She's the Program Director of the Children's Environmental Health Program at National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. The program will run for about 45 minutes, then we'll have a brief Q&A at the end. You can also email questions to us for those of you online at theforum@hsph.harvard.edu. You can also participate right now in a live chat discussion that's happening on the Forum website. We're here to discuss what happens to people's health, particularly children's health, when they're exposed to unhealthy levels of chemicals in their drinking water, their food, and the environment. The topic has taken on a profound resonance with the news that residents of Flint, Michigan, including thousands of children, have been exposed to unsafe levels of lead in their drinking water amid allegations that authorities were initially dismissive of their concerns. It's getting obviously a lot of press around the world, and it's exposing sort of a hidden area of public health concern that Nicholas Kristof, in particular at the Times, has been writing about a lot recently. If you're looking for a good primer, just look at Are You a Toxic Waste Disposal Site from the Sunday Times. Anyway, I just want to start right off turning to Philippe. Give us the context to start. What happened in Flint? How does that situation relate to chemicals in our environment and their impact on the brain?
Well, in a way, it's surprising it suddenly would happen in Flint, because this could have happened in just about any community in this country, because we have used lead for water pipes since the 1800s, and we've used lead for soldering, for putting water conduits together, and there's lead all over in our water distribution system. Lead was a cheap, malleable metal that was very easy to use for this purpose. That's why we did it way up into the 1900s. So there's lead piping all over in this country. What happened in Flint was that they changed the water supply. So they got water from the Flint River that happened to be more corrosive, and therefore it leached lead into the water. And so it was a change in the water quality that made the difference. And changes like that have happened all over the country many times. And the basic problem is that we have a toxic metal in our water distribution system. So, and this is something that's really troubling to us in public health. And if I may show the first slide, I will share with you why we are so worried about lead and children's brain development. The fact is that we as a species have the smartest, the most complicated brain in the animal kingdom. And because it is so complicated, the process of developing it is extremely complex and at the same time vulnerable. And the point is then, if you're exposed to toxic element like lead during that period, then things can go wrong and you only get one chance to develop a brain. So you're stuck with that the rest of your life. And so the changes are permanent, and it is particularly in early childhood and fetal development that you're sensitive. So when something like this happens in Flint, it means that there is going to be permanent effects that are going to last for a very long time.
And I understand that the level at which there's concern has dropped considerably over the years as more research has been done. It's down to basically no safe level.
That's true, because in the beginning we didn't really have children with low lead exposures to compare with. So as we took lead out of gasoline and we started to control canned food, et cetera, then we the lead exposures dropped, and suddenly we realized that what we thought was safe was indeed not safe. So, I mean, you can think about all of the IQ points that Americans have lost in the past simply because we were ignorant.
And of course, it also has effects on adults. Maybe we'll get a little bit to that later, different sorts of effects. I think we want to turn now to a video. This is about the Flint crisis. It's been declared a federal emergency, as you know. This is a video by Ben Hancock and Andrew McLean, and it's being used with permission from MLive.
I never would have thought I'd be drinking contaminated water surrounded by the Great Lakes.
Flint, Michigan is having a water crisis. Currently, the National Guard and Red Cross are handing out bottled water and filters to residents. On January 16th, President Obama declared a federal emergency in Flint, freeing up $5 million in federal aid. According to the EPA, the maximum safe level of lead in drinking water is 0 parts per billion. 5 is the threshold for concern. Flint water has been regularly tested above 100 ppb by a Virginia Tech research team. And in at least one home, the team measured above 13,000. 5,000 is considered toxic waste by the agency.
That water is much more corrosive, and that corrosivity is causing the lead to leach out of lead service lines, galvanized pipe, and copper lines that use lead solder.
So that question to you, Jeffrey, how did we get here? How did this happen? This is entirely preventable.
This is just negligence at an astounding degree, because we have known for decades, even within the kind of community of people who are going to maybe not pay as much attention to public health problems, that we had a real problem with lead. There are many places in this country where people have had very high lead levels for a long time. And we know now, and we knew 20 and 30 and 40 years ago, that lead was bad for you. But we have not stepped up to the plate to replace the lead, get rid of the lead in our water supply, the same way that we have in terms of lead paint and in gasoline and things like that. So in many ways, this is a failure of political will. This has been a hidden problem. This has been something, lead is not something you taste. It's not something that turns you green or blue or purple or gives you spots or things like that. It just makes your kids a little less smart than they should be and gives you hypertension and does things like that. If you could key up the slide, please, of the health effects. And so the issues around this have been well known for a long time. We have different degrees of certainty about some of this, but again, this is a failure of political will that exists in terms of dealing with this. Somewhat facetiously, I say to people, if Al-Qaeda put a poison in our water that would make our kids less smart and do this to us, we'd all be all over it. But instead, we tolerate this kind of intolerable situation where we have low-level, chronic, bad stuff happening. One of the things I'd like to point out is that a lot of the neurocognitive effects of lead, in terms of decreasing how smart you are things that likely happen with very low exposures. It's not like you need a very high exposure to have this, although, as you have just seen, people in Flint were getting very toxic levels in terms of their water that could lead to all sorts of problems. When I was in my training as a pediatrician, I took care of many children who had seizures from this. And we would give them really nasty chemicals to suck the lead out of them. But to be honest, it didn't do a good job because it's put in their bones for their lives. This stuff, when it gets into you, is with you forever. This is not something where you get this exposure and then it washes out. It's with you forever. Now, lots of cities have had this problem. The most dramatic example over the last, say, 20 years has been in Washington, D.C., where, again, there was a change in the water supply in terms of the way that it was treated. It became more corrosive. People were exposed to very high levels of lead in the households in specific neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and this was essentially covered up by the people who were taking care of the water supply there. I believe that allegations of something along this line have also been made in Flint. I just want to point out that lead is in some ways the one contaminant that we test for. We don't test for many other contaminants. So we can use this as the canary in the coal mine, or we can use this as the tip of the iceberg if we want to. But there are other problems with our water supply in terms of other chemicals that can affect cognition as well. But I really must say, I think we know enough about lead to take care of it. We know enough about what the problems are, and this is a big burden on the population. It's silly not to be taking care of this, if not stupid.
You are all being so succinct so far that, Mark, you can run for a while if you want, although it would be great. Actually, I would say stick with your 5 minutes, and we'll have more time for questions at the end. But so we've heard about risks associated with lead in the water. You've looked at health risks associated with other contaminants, including things in our air, pesticides. What have you found?
Sure. So let me start first with lead still, just to point out that, I've done work on lead, lots of people have done work on lead, Philippe has done some of the earliest work on lead, and we know a tremendous amount about the health effects of lead, and obviously effects on children are particularly important. We know things about behavioral effects, cognitive effects. I've done work on the other end of the spectrum, so showing associations with neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's disease, and as was pointed out by Jeff, if you're exposed to lead at almost any point in your life, it largely gets deposited in your bones. It not only stays there, but bones turn over slowly, so as you age and at times when bone turns over, it can come back out again to haunt you all over again later in life. And so we know a tremendous amount about it, and that's unfortunately, I guess, in part why this is such an issue is that it's lead, and we know about it, we regulate it, we have levels that we try to keep under and things of that sort. But there's all sorts of other stuff out there that is potentially damaging to humans, children and adults. We're concerned about plasticizers, phthalates, BPA in bottles, perfluoralkyl compounds that are more recently in the news, pesticides. All of these things certainly have the potential to be toxic, and a lot of people are looking at them, myself included for some of them, of health effects of exposure to these things. But we don't know nearly as much as we know about lead, so we're kind of behind the 8 ball here. Even take something like pesticides, where I've done some work on effects on mental health, anxiety, effects on Parkinson's disease, and in fact many others have done that as well. There's a lot of people who have worked on pesticides and Parkinson's disease, and there is a lot of evidence that pesticides are related to the development of Parkinson's disease. But pesticides is a huge group, right? So there are many things in there, many different kinds of pesticides, from the Rachel Carson days of DDT and organochlorines that stick around forever to now more rapidly degrading ones like organophosphates, but that may still have health problems. And we know, the evidence is very robust that pesticides are related to Parkinson's, but it is very hard to say which pesticide. If there is one, it may be many of them, right? And so that's a fundamental problem we face in these health studies, is that we are not exposed to one thing. We're exposed to lots of things, and that's an extremely difficult issue to address from a scientific perspective, and it makes it hard when it comes to setting regulations. We tend to look at things one at a time, but unfortunately we kind of have to do that. But all of these other things have to be considered. And one of the issues with many of them, so another thing that I look at is air pollution, and recently we've done work looking at effects of air pollution, exposure to the mother during pregnancy, and risk of autism in her child. And there's a growing body of literature now suggesting that that is happening. But we don't think that air pollution, per se, is the absolute, the one thing that's doing it. Because it's affecting the mother, my suspicions are it's engaging processes in the mother that are harmful to the fetus. But those are processes that can be affected by lead, by many other types of contaminants. So we look at these ones that we can measure well and that we know a lot about, and they tell us something's going on. But I think they're sort of canaries in the coal mine for the other stuff that we just can't get a grasp on as well because of their properties. And we don't have the body of evidence behind it to say, yes, something is going on there. But certainly my suspicion is, for many of them, something is going on. And if we sort of ignore all the other stuff, and in this country we tend to assume something is innocent until proven guilty, but to my mind that's sort of a dangerous game of Russian roulette with chemicals that I wouldn't want to play if I didn't have to.
Thanks very much. Okay, we'll continue on down the end of the table, off the end of the table toward the corner of the room, to Kimberly, coming to us from, actually, I guess it's Virginia, not D.C., just outside D.C.
It's North Carolina, but that's
close.
close.
Forgive me. You guys in the NIH, and you're all over the place, so forgive me.
Yes, we are.
Yes. So we've heard how children in particular are affected by toxic exposures. You direct the Center for Children's Environmental Health and Disease Prevention Research. tell us what those centers do.
Sure. So in 1996, there was an executive order from President Clinton to really look and protect our children from these environmental threats. So these centers, along with NIEHS and EPA, we collaborated in 1999 to launch the First Center program. It included community-based research, intervention programs, where we were out across 10 sites looking at what are the issues that are of most concern for those specific communities. So we weren't in everybody's community and backyard, but we really did assess and take a preliminary look at what were the things that were affecting communities, what they were concerned with, and we did something about it. Now, this program has grown in the past 17 years to be over 22 centers funded, 14 currently, and lead, I have to say, hasn't been, luckily, a big issue for most of the centers, but besides Bruce Landfear's in Cincinnati. And what we've learned from these is kind of goes back to what Mark was talking about. It is a soup. You know, the children are vulnerable. They're developing pound per pound. They eat more, drink more, breathe more. Their organ systems are developing. So we look at that as the most vulnerable of our population, plus we are their voice. They don't have a voice for us. So these centers have really worked proactively to not only address the issues that the research community have, but also what the community are concerned with. And they've learned a lot. They've learned a lot that it's not one chemical. They've tried to develop programs and protocols and methods to look at more than one chemical. They've been at the forefront, taking the translation of their research through the community outreach translation course back to the community and to the policymakers and to the stakeholders to communicate their findings. And they've had some big impact, not only in research, but also in regulatory, as EPA is one of our partners. And we work collaboratively with EPA and NIH scientists to really look at what these issues are. But Mark is absolutely right. It's not one chemical. We're dealing with pesticides, consumer products. Lead being a source from water has not been looked at specifically in our centers. They do some screening and also get some feedback from those public health departments. And that's where we are today. So this is not surprising for us. But the agencies are working collectively to address the problem. It may seem that a little late, but we're doing the best we can. I know DHHS is on the ground and working with the communities. EPA is on the ground and leading the federal science response. We're part of the action plan and the science advisors, and working with our centers and our research scientists like Philippe and Mark, who are part of our centers program as well, developing messaging even for other communities that are worried about these low-level lead that could be in their water as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. We're actually already ready to move on to the discussion part of the panel, which I think is going to be the most interesting. Get some dialogue going between everybody up here. Before we move to the audience, we're going to have plenty of time for that as well. I guess we're going to start this with another video. As society has become more industrialized, people face increasing ways of being exposed to chemicals. This video is from a nonprofit group called Healthy Child, Healthy World, a program of the Environmental Working Group, which has given us permission to show it. The clip demonstrates day-to-day health hazards that we may not consider. So what is the answer, or what are some of the answers? I imagine that there are more answers and more questions than we could ever deal with here today. But I want to go first back to Kim. I mean, obviously, one of the big focuses in that video and in this panel is on children. So what can consumers, parents, others do to limit exposure to their kids?
To lead specifically, the issue is really around us protecting the community on these exposures. So we have a safeguard in place where the water is checked through the treatment plants. If you're on a well water, there's some private agencies. We also have it in place where there are blood screening of children, and those elevated levels would be reported back. And what I would say to parents is, not knowing where you need to know where you're getting your water and where your system is coming from. Have your water checked. EPA offers free checking in these communities. We can provide support on where else you can find to have your water checked. Know a bit about your residents and when you're renovating, if you have lead-based paint, but we're there to help. We've set up websites for community members from anywhere to get information on low-level lead and what to do about your homes and how to test and what kind of filtration systems to use. And they're very simple add-ons to your tap. There's procedures as running your cold water beforehand. So we do have those recommendations. And then and take your child, if you don't know, to a pediatrician or to get you guidance on getting some baseline levels in your children if you think you are exposed. It has raised the awareness through all of us that even live here in North Carolina about our homes and our structure and how we're protected. And I think everybody is thinking about that nowadays. And another thing to talk about, I know there isn't an intervention to rewind and take back the lead, but we are talking about the nutritional benefits of a fortified breakfast, about iron, calcium-enriched foods that can actually be helpful, about an enriched environment for those deficits that we think are already in place. And this is a vulnerable community, and we really need to reach out to them and provide them with this information and these interventions that are known to play a mitigating role in the effects of lead on children.
I want to ask a question that I hope will frame the discussion for the next three of you and then beyond that for everybody. We've got lead in our pipes. We've got lots of other exposures that are coming to us from different ways. Are potentially neurotoxic compounds being introduced so fast in terms of just the industry moving so fast that we can't keep up with them? Are they so embedded in our infrastructure that it's impossible to get them out? Or is there some kind of bigger failure of political will to address these problems, prevent them before they happen, or at least deal with them after they've already become obvious? And I guess I'm going to start with you guys. You've done a lot of work on infrastructure, both here and elsewhere.
Yes. Let me just address a little bit about what you've been talking about this. So we have a problem with lead, which is an old infrastructure. It's buried in the ground. Nobody wants to really spend their tax money on replacing pipes if they're not busted. Let's just be honest. Nobody wants to do this. We have a problem with infrastructure in the United States, and it extends to bridges, pipes, lots of different things. So that's kind of a background. Another piece that's a background piece to really bring to the forefront, just as you've alluded to, is that a lot of the chemicals, and just as Marcus said, they're assumed to be okay. We have a system in the United States where we assume the introduction of a new chemical into manufacturing or into your household is basically going to be all right until it's proven otherwise. And so many of us think that's backwards, that something should be proven first to be safe before lots of people get exposure to it. I've had the experience of grappling with this for almost 2 decades through prior work at the EPA, and there's a vast number of chemicals. There isn't the money and infrastructure capacity, if you will, to be testing all of these all in one go. And so in some countries, what they do is, from a policy point of view, is they say it's better just not to have them in the environment. Don't have them in the workplace, don't have them in your water, and don't have them in your home. So in that circumstance, then, in fact, you wouldn't allow this soup of chemicals that we live in to be something that we're all exposed to. We would come up with more comprehensive water treatment that would remove these chemicals. Or we would not allow manufacturers to dump them into our surface waters or groundwater or things like that. So there's both this element about what has already happened. We have been given the infrastructure that we've got. We have got the lead in our pipes, in our houses, the solder that's used to put the pipes together. I'd point out that many schools in this country have fixtures, which are old fixtures, just as the schools are old. And in its infinite wisdom, Congress allowed fixtures with up to 8% lead to be labeled as lead-free. So your children could be going to school and actually get their biggest lead exposure from the bubbler where they get their drinking water during the course of the day. I mean, this is really, we need to face up to that and deal with it. And then the second issue is one which really we need to look forward and say, what is it we're going to step up to in terms of removing these things? We don't have the money to look at these 10,000, 100,000 different chemicals that we live in the soup of. And in fact, from a scientific point of view, we know how to study one thing versus one other thing. We don't know how to study 5 against 5, and we don't know how to study 10,000 against 5,000 or 1,000. We don't have the tools to do that, nor is it likely we will in our lifetimes. So I think that if you think about those things, then there are solutions, but they are solutions which are comprehensive ones. They are not ones that nickel and dime us in terms of which chemical at what time and so forth like that are there.
Philippe.
I think it's a matter of negligence that is so overwhelming. It's not just industry that's pushing new chemicals. We have in this country legislation from 1976 in regard to chemicals control. 1976, can you remember who was the president in 1976? It's so long ago. And Congress has done nothing. And according to that ancient law, industry is virtually free to market whatever they want. Pesticides, for example, don't really need to get tested if they can damage brain development in animals. And therefore, we know today that Americans are exposed to pesticides. We can measure the residues in urine samples. They are exposed to levels that we know for sure can damage brain development in a fetus if a pregnant woman is exposed to those levels. We know this is happening. And still, there's no proper control of the residues in food because you always get the results after the fact, and the pesticides that are being marketed are definitely not safe for human brains because, this was never tested. We have a situation with mercury. I see regularly hair mercury concentration results or blood mercury concentrations. And I see frequently results that are 8 or 10 times higher than the exposure limit that the US EPA considers safe. And people have no idea. This happens among pregnant women. They're passing on the chemicals to the fetus. The chemicals get into the developing brain, and just like with lead, they can damage brain development, and that will last for a lifetime. So I think that, yes, it's getting more complicated, but Congress has been discussing for several years now how to modernize chemicals legislation. We still don't know where this is going to end up. It looks like it's not going to be very ambitious and that we are going to continue to have problems in the future. But I would say in regard to infrastructure, yes, there's a big deficit there, but it's also true in regard to the legislation.
Mark.
Yeah, so I would also add to this, and it's come up, and in this country, I think we often feel like, well, let the individual make the choice, right? And I do have the wherewithal to say, I'm going to use that plastic bottle that's BPA containing, or I'm not, and I'm going to go take a glass container, or I'm going to, have my pipes tested for lead and, get bottled water if it's bad. But I think that's dangerous on many fronts. I mean, on one front, these things get introduced so much, and in fact, often information on what's in there is proprietary, so we don't even know. So even someone like me, I don't. I mean, there are many products that contain phthalates that don't really have to say they contain phthalates because they're not an active ingredient, right? And so I can't even make that choice. So that's one point. The second point, and I think it's quite important, is to talk about the fact that this sort of highlights a very important health disparities issue, right? There are communities that can't make the choices that I can make. I could buy organic to avoid pesticides from my local farm. Those tend to be more expensive. I also have sort of space and time to think about that, to make those choices. And in many underserved populations, and populations that are maybe working 2 jobs just to get by, not only don't often know what's coming at them, don't have the financial ability to make the choices I could make to try and avoid some of this stuff, but also simply don't have the cognitive space to think about that. That is not the most pressing issue to them if they're just trying to eat or heat their home. And so yet these things are going to affect them and affect their ability to do all of that stuff. So it's really, and let me add one other thing to that, is that there's also research, in fact, in the context of lead, that lead is far more harmful to a developing fetus if it's paired with stress to the mother. Right? So you are now, there is research suggesting that. I mean, you can talk about its validity and whatnot, but that suggestion is there, and there's a lot of people looking at that, and if that's the case, we're just compounding the issue, right? So it really becomes a societal issue where we have to say, are we taking care of everybody in the society? And we can't say, it's unfair to just say, let's let the individual decide. We have to, as a society, say, we want to protect people, and that means everybody. And so it has to come from policy, it has to come from some regulation, and that means not just allowing everything in there. We can't do everything. We don't have the tools to look at at this stage, 5-10 exposures at once, and all the possible interactions among that soup. We're trying. We're doing a lot of work on that. NIEHS held a workshop last year on exactly that issue, so we really are trying to delve into that. But we can still do what we can, and I would put in a plug for simple toxicology, that we can test things quickly and rapidly to see what kinds of properties they have and make some decision based on at least some information on whether we're going to let these things go willy-nilly into the environment.
So a DIY approach to trying to shield yourself from these things is going to leave a lot of people behind.
Yeah.
Kim, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. It's more of a national conversation about these chemicals that are in our environment. And we at NIEHS talk about and think about this daily. And I know, being a mom myself, when I go to a pediatrician's office or an OBGYN, I don't think they have other things to be concerned about than the environmental exposures. But we deal with this every day. With Mark and Grangine, we look at compounds, we call them emerging compounds, and now we have legacy compounds, and we divide them differently. But we really are trying to strategize of the compounds, the class of compounds we should focus on and hit hard. Philippe has led a very strong effort on endocrine disruptors, both nationally and globally, to really talk about the compounds that we have that activate those pathways that we know are harmful. But it's true, pregnant moms and the developing fetus, it's the most vulnerable time during all those windows of susceptibility, and some of those changes, unfortunately, we're seeing in the animal research are showing that they may be permanent and they may be passed on from generations. And so it's critical for us to really have these conversations, not only here at NIEHS, but nationally. We have them with our partners, and we really rely on our scientists and our community folks to really have these discussions, translate the science more rapidly, what we know, and in what forum that takes from our national toxicology program here at NIEHS. This is their number one concern, and they're responding to the community's concern. They're responding to the research concern. But this is really a collaborative effort that we all really need to be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Kim. We've touched, obviously, we focus a lot on lead because that is so much in the forefront of the news right now. We've talked a little bit about pesticides, but there are literally thousands of compounds out there, whether they be an element like lead or mercury or a human-created compound. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what some of those are, where we encounter them, but Philippe also has a nice graph that sort of demonstrates how big a problem this is in terms of what's out there. Can we show that second slide, please?
Yeah, I developed this as an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is those 12 compounds that we know for sure are toxic to the development of the human brain. And that's of course lead and methyl mercury from contaminated seafood, and there's arsenic that can occur in drinking water, and fluoride and manganese. There's a couple of solvents, there's a couple of pesticides. Actually, one of the pesticides is DDT, which is banned. The other one is chlorpyrifos, which is one of the most commonly used pesticides. It is well documented that it can harm brain development in humans. We can find it very frequently, traces of it in urine samples from people because they're exposed through the food. We're still using it, and we know it's toxic to human brain development. Now, the next part of the iceberg, the 214, those are the chemicals that include the 12. Those are the chemicals where we know that they can pass into the brain in humans and cause damage to neurological functions, so that there are symptoms or neurological disease. And so this is something that has been reported in the scientific literature. We just don't know if this is true also in regard to babies, because the studies have not been done. But any parent or grandparent would agree with me that those 214 compounds have no place in a baby's circulation or baby's brain. Yet, we're not doing anything to control them. Because, this is what Jeff said before, we would like to see a proof before we make such a drastic decision. And then if you go further down the iceberg, we know of more compounds that are toxic to brains of rats or whatever species that have been tested in the laboratory. And then there's a whole chemical universe. So to me, Mark's model where parents choose for themselves, it is simply not going to work, because we just don't know what to tell them. And I mean, I have 2 glasses of water here in front of me, and if you told me that one of them was from Maine and contained a lot of arsenic, and one of them was from Flint and contained a lot of lead, I would not know which one to drink from, and I couldn't favor one over the other. I couldn't see, maybe one of them is actually pure water. I can't see it. I can't choose. It's impossible. But this problem is also true for us as physicians, that we simply don't know where the answers are. And this is why we need to consider this from a perspective of also being grandparents or parents, whatever you are, because this has to do with our responsibility for the brains of the future. And I hope there's going to come some really smart people around, given all of the problems that we have created in my generation.
And I hope they've been drinking good water to keep them smart. I mean, here in Boston, we're in a pretty good situation. We have a reservoir that is not coming from, we're not getting our water from a river that's downstream of other folks. We have a really quite a clean system. Obviously there's a problem with the distribution in the city, as there is in any old city, but I think probably we can be more sure here in Boston that our water is okay to drink.
You want some from Maine?
Anyway, so for the rest of you, what are some of the things that you're most concerned about that are out there that we haven't discussed?
Well, right. I want to pick up on a theme that has been touched on by the other speakers, which is we also don't know what we don't know. We know about what we do know. So we know about lead. So there's a certain amount of testing which is done by water utilities for lead. Again, we screen our children. It's almost impossible to make it to kindergarten without a child having been tested for lead. Having said that, that of course is not representative of this larger universe of all these things that we're exposed to. And then the other piece to this is we shouldn't be feeling warm and fuzzy about how good the testing is that is in place already. First, we don't have methods for testing for some of the compounds that we would like to know about that are relatively inexpensive. If it costs $500 to do each test, then of course you can imagine there are going to be many fewer of those tests done. When it comes to something as simple as lead, simple, I'm going to say in quotation marks, we don't really have an accurate map of what places and what cities actually, what houses are at risk of having high lead. the amount of testing that's done by water utilities assumes that they have a steady, regular supply of water that has not changed. Yet in Washington, D.C., and in Flint and in many other places, we've seen high lead levels when there's a change in the water. And so the testing regimen doesn't really necessarily change in terms of being more frequent or more comprehensive or things like that. I think at this point, when it comes to lead, we need to look ourselves square in the face and say, we need to do a national mapping. We need to do something which is more comprehensive. Let's not walk away and bury the problem. Let's actually look at where the lead exposures are happening. And then we can also talk about where we think there might be chemical exposures based upon knowing where there are Superfund sites or where we have other kinds of things which are at risk for water. Many of you may be surprised to know that your water is treated in many places just by filtration, perhaps through sand, which does a good job taking the crud out, but it doesn't necessarily remove chemicals very well. And then we treat the water with things like chlorine in order to get rid of the bad bacteria, but that doesn't do anything for these chemical compounds. I have friends who've said for 20 years that we should be running all our water through activated charcoal and using more advanced methods of disinfection like ultraviolet. Well, perhaps we should. Maybe this is a reflection moment for us to think about that. If you do something like activated charcoal to treat your water, you're going to absorb not only what you know about, but the things you don't know about. And I think that we have to act proactively as public health professionals to argue for something which is a more comprehensive way of dealing with what we know and what we don't know.
So, another point that I want to bring up, two issues. One is around kind of awareness, and the other is around the idea of, in some ways, the problem of the scientific method and approach, and how issues with that get seized upon. So the first about awareness is I think it's incredibly important that we do things like this and we do other things to get the general idea that there are compounds that can be bad to your health, to your fetus. I think that's growing, but I got an email from a woman in the UK, not the US, but in the UK just this morning, asking me about the air pollution autism thing because she's pregnant and she works in a garage, workshop over the garage, and she was getting all sorts of fumes, and she even went to her GP to say, is this potentially bad? And the GP said, no, you're okay, unless you're getting violently sick on the side. And she stated to me that people just don't realize this and sort of thanked me for my work, but we need to get it out there more so that people understand that these are issues, right? The second thing is the issue of, the scientific method is hard. Studying these chemicals is really difficult, and especially in epidemiology studies where lots is going on at the same time. It's not a dish. What that means is we tend to make statements that are couched in some uncertainty. We're always a little bit uncertain about that. That gets seized upon by certain sectors to say, well, there's doubt about this whole thing, so we don't really know, so why should we do anything, and you don't really know if it's safe. And I think a big discussion has to be had around the issue of how much do we need to know before we do something, right? And you have to be very wary of this idea of sort of people putting the other side up and saying, oh, this study here says you're not right, and therefore let's just forget about the whole issue.
But Mark, you need to ask the question, do you want that stuff in your grandchild's brain?
Absolutely, right, and that's where we need to start. But what I'm saying is that we need to battle against this approach by some in the society to say, there's scientific doubt out there, there are people on either side, therefore it's probably not real. One, that's probably not true because you can do any study and get some, do it wrong and get some bad result, and then that gets seized upon as saying it's not there. But two, maybe that isn't the issue. The issue is what Philippe is saying, is that, look, let's start from the point of these things look like bad actors. I mean, the case of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, we knew they were bad a long time ago. They've been banned since the 70s, right? So what does a company do when they no longer can make PCB? They change one chlorine or bromine or something, right? And they make it PBB instead and say, oh, well, we don't know anything about that one. Well, it turns out that one's pretty bad too, right? So, if we don't do something from the start, we're just going to be repeating this problem over and over again. And so all I'm saying is that science is difficult, and we always have limitations sections to our paper. Those should not be used to say there is not a problem. We need to start from.
Kim, looked like you wanted to weigh in. We want to go to Q&A from the audience pretty quickly.
Sure.
But
So I just wanted to build on what Mark was saying, that it is very hard for the epidemiologist, and I'll disclose that I am one, but I think this is where the basic science partnering with the epidemiologist really is critical so that we can show it not only this correlational data or association that may be limited by a lot of uncertainty, but when you have biological feasibility and plausibility that you're seeing it from the animal studies, that evidence needs to be weighed as well. And now that our epidemiologists are collaborating through many efforts, I think the evidence is getting better and stronger, and hopefully we can facilitate getting some more of these culprits, these chemicals eliminated from the environment.
And I want to ask just one quick, it's a question which I'm sure there's a very long answer to, but I want a very short answer. We've all talked here about the need to switch from innocent until proven guilty to perhaps more guilty till proven innocent, or at least the precautionary principle, more sort of a European model. But it's very difficult to prove a negative. It's very difficult to prove something is not harmful. So what's the threshold? What level of certainty do we have to get to?
I mean, that's a larger discussion all around. But I mean, and as I say, we're never going to know everything because things get mixed up together and do different things. But there are, I mean, Philippe talked about, neurotoxicity tests in a dish. I mean, those can be done reasonably quickly compared to epidemiological studies, and there's no reason we shouldn't be doing them. If it doesn't show anything, it doesn't totally mean it's safe. But there is some bar there. Obviously, if it is killing neurons in a dish, you don't want it in your kid, right? So that's at least a place to start.
Anybody else really quick before we go to Q&A?
Well, I'd really argue for comprehensive solutions, that we need to think big and we need to think comprehensively in terms of what we come up with. And I would argue that, again, we're never going to know what we don't know. We're only going to know what we do know. And, scientists can't talk about what isn't known.
On that, you would agree with Donald Rumsfeld. Lisa, let's go to Q&A. We have one first from, I think, online.
Right. We'll just do a few questions. We don't have a lot of time. People have been writing in about the Zika virus. What are the thoughts of the panelists regarding the water contamination being attributed to the Zika virus epidemic in Brazil?
I assume that's pesticides?
There was a paper, there's been research from Argentina that had suggested that, but it's controversial, so.
So I think the evidence that the pesticide is causing the microcephaly, small brains in these poor children in South America is basically it doesn't exist. It's a true and unrelated kind of circumstance, perhaps. And in the last few weeks, we now have more and more information where some of these poor children have passed away, and at autopsy what's been found inside the brain is the signs of an infection. And they have actually found the virus inside the brains. So I think we're all concerned about the possibility of chemicals causing neurotoxicity, but we don't see small brains as evidence of the neurotoxicity usually. And again, in this particular pesticide that's been used, it's been found to cause other problems, but it doesn't cause the same thing that's been found in those infants. So my personal suspicion is that there is no connection there.
And I think I would add to that, as I understand it, and I haven't seen the actual papers on this, that the specific one they're talking about in Argentina, some of the cities that have the highest rates of the microcephaly from Zika aren't actually using it in the water. So that sort of says it's not that pesticide.
But let's put this in perspective. What we talk about here is chemicals. And the problem we face in public health is that 1 out of 6 children have neurobehavioral problems or delays. 1 out of 6 children, and we really don't know why. We can see there are increasing rates of various diagnoses. And it's not because doctors are more eager to use pharmaceuticals. There are clear increases. It is very obvious that the chemicals we're exposing the next generation to are causing some of these problems. We need to figure out exactly what they are. And if we can't figure out exactly what they are, well, we got to do something, because they have the right not to forgive us. I think they shouldn't.
And that's not to say, of course, that putting pesticides in drinking water is a good idea. It may just be a matter of the lesser of several evils that have to be chosen from. And
I think this was a larvicide to control the mosquito population in the water. But thank you. Okay, I'll do one more here from online, and then we can do one from the audience. Lead exposure has been shown to lower IQ and has been linked to violence and criminal behavior as well. What can we expect on that front in a situation like Flint, where children already are exposed to so many social stresses as a result of poverty and other inequalities? Is anyone ramping up the social support or the mental health services in light of this crisis?
I can totally address that. Yes, SAMHSA is on site. They are offering assistance and management system through human services. So they are addressing this issue. They're looking not only at the short-term but long-term consequences. So they are on site, and they're working with the local community and the local pediatricians and public health department to address those issues.
Great, thank you.
One of the things that's sort of the consequence that I think is the unsaid question is, what about all of the other cities and towns across the United States where people have exposure to lead and don't know about it? There are no special services for them. And one of the things that I point out when colleagues of mine say, how will we pay for this? I want to point out to you that the people who live in Flint, when those kids get older and maybe they need some help, or maybe they're not as productive in society as they would have liked to have been, maybe they won't finish high school or go to college or graduate college, we all bear that. We have a system where we share these risks in this United States because we have social networks and things like that. So this is a tragedy for the lives of those children and those families in Flint, but it's also something where indeed it affects all of us in one way or another. We all pay for this kind of contamination, this kind of hit that these kids' brains are taking, and there as well as many other places. So I think it's, I think when we say stepping up to the plate, we're already on the plate. The only question is, how high is that plate, or what are the consequences of being on the plate?
These costs have actually been calculated, and because you can, if you compare kids with different IQ levels, or I guess it has been done in adults, and you compare their income levels, taxable incomes, then you can see that for each IQ point gained, it's something like 1.5% extra income, and if you then calculate that for a lifetime and discount it down to value in your hand today, then each IQ point is worth, I think the current value is something like $15,000. But if you are looking at a whole population, and with lead, for example, lead is currently causing losses of billions of dollars per year. So the investment that you need for your water supply system, it's already there. It's an investment in the future income from smarter brains. And we need to do that with lead. We need to do that with several other compounds that are just asking to be regulated. We haven't done it. And then we need to put some better science together so we can develop a strategy so that we can wholeheartedly protect the next generation's brains, even if we don't know for sure, because it's our damn responsibility.
I would also point out about this, I mean, that it is very important to have all these services, add all this stuff for the people because of the lead contamination in Flint. But again, lead is getting the attention because we know a whole lot about it, and it shouldn't, in some ways, be the only one. I mean, we should be providing these services in many situations where we know there's lots of contamination, right? Because, as Philippe says, a lot of that stuff that is not lead, that is everything else, is probably having effects like this too. And so, we ought to recognize that some of these behavioral issues that permeate societies, some portion of that is probably due to the chemical soup. And so providing services should be done, but it shouldn't be, oh, it's lead, because if we wait to have the information we have on lead for everything else, we're never going to provide services to people. So.
Okay, time for maybe one or two quick questions from the audience.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to ask a question. I'm from the UK, and so we have a public healthcare system where we kind of the Public Health England essentially overall, overarchingly looks after all of the kind of exposures and monitors all the water and things. One of the things I found surprising in this case was that the levels were known about from an academic institution but weren't fed through to kind of the public institution that deals with or manages the water supply, from kind of the university testing the levels, but then the kind of the government agency not being able to take that forward. I was just wondering, is that a system level thing? Is that a common thing? Or how much integration between kind of the testing and the actual policy, is that a system level issue, or is that just a local issue that was unique to Flint?
So I'm sure these guys could comment on this more, but I will say that, I mean, in this particular instance, that it seems like there was, willful negligence of not wanting to hear the information from the academics.
Yeah, I think that most utilities around the country see themselves as public health actors, and they see themselves as protecting not only you, but their own children and themselves and things like this. So it's particularly striking that these high values were found and nothing was done. It's very, very shocking indeed. It seems to truly go beyond what is acceptable behavior. My experience has been that generally, when people find there's something like this, if there's contamination in the water with bacteria, for example, you get a boil water alert or something like that. So I'm sure that this will be, further explored, to use polite language, in the Flint circumstances in terms of what happened. But in general, when utilities find something which is something of, that rises to public health concern, and there's a pattern of what they know what to do, that's what they do. I have no idea what happened in terms of these high lead levels and why it wasn't acted on earlier.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I'd like to give everybody a chance to make one last comment, and I hope it'll be sort of like a news you can use moment. Obviously, we're in a moment in politics when it's very hard to get anything done, anything changed. But what are perhaps some realistic policy changes that you see could happen? Barring that, what are some things that people can do to protect themselves? 30 seconds each.
Well, again, I have to come back to my comment that, I don't think it should be a question of what we can do to protect ourselves. We can, as I said, you can eat organic to avoid pesticides if you're concerned. You can have your water tested and change your filtration system if there's lead in it. But some people can do that, other people can't do that, and I don't think the burden should be on the individual to have to do that, because for many of these chemicals, even someone with the wherewithal is not going to know what to look for and be concerned about. It has to start from a more, government policy type top-down change in thinking.
Well, I hope that we use this moment as a way to step up to the plate. I've used that phrase a fair amount this hour. I would like to see our political leaders quit playing politics, and I'd like to see them start playing let's protect the public and let's do what we're supposed to do. I'd like to see this failure of leadership to go away. I'd like to see us map the amount of lead exposure that people have in the country in some real way. It's astounding that we have no map. And then deal with it in a comprehensive fashion.
Lee?
My advice is ask questions. Everybody should ask questions. I think we have a common goal in wanting this to become a better world. It's not in a good shape right now, and certainly the next generation is not growing up under the safe circumstances that we would want. Therefore, ask questions. Ask questions to your congressman. Ask questions to your mayor. Ask questions to the scientists and the regulators. Ask those questions. Is this really safe for my child? And keep pushing. So perhaps with time, if we're all asking the same questions, we will end up with a, let's say, common strategy that will be very different from this lack of strategy that we really have at the present time.
And Kimberly, last word from you.
I think the takeaway point for us at NIHS is that we're going to continue to study and look at these health effects, not only of lead and low-level lead, but of all these other contaminants. And, the children are especially vulnerable, but the adults are affected too. And we want to demonstrate that a safe environment is important to all for public health, and work through our grant programs, work in our collaborations with our other federal agencies to translate the science more rapidly, and to get funding out for environmental health scientists to continue the rigorous science that they do and get the translation of their work throughout the system, so this doesn't happen again.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, that wraps it up. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was fantastic. We could have gone all afternoon. Philippe Grandjean, Jeffrey Griffiths, Mark Weifskoff, Kimberly Gray. I'm Peter Thompson from Public Radio's The World. Do want to encourage you to tune in for the next forum. It's appropriately enough about the Zika crisis and the latest findings. It'll be on March 4th. That's Friday, March 4th, from 12:30 to 1:30, a little later starting time. And of course, you can find the whole schedule of what's coming up, plus past webcasts from previous forums at forumhsph.org. Thanks a lot.